May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I don't know about you, but in my mourning, I don't feel very blessed. And I'm not 100% sure that I want to be comforted. I realize that this verse from what we call the Beatitudes found in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5 is speaking of how it will be one day. But when we have lost someone, one day is very far off. And our pain is very present. And our grief, well, it just hurts. And in a way, we're okay with that for the moment. It seems, however, to make everyone around us extremely uncomfortable. They're patient for about 3 to 5 days and then wonder why you're not over it yet. But grief is not something that you get over. In the grief group that I run here once a month through the Senior Center, we've been referring to grief like a sharp rock in our shoe. At first, it cuts your foot with each step, but over time, both your foot gets a little calloused and the rock gets a little softer edge. It's still there months, even years later, and it's still uncomfortable and awkward, and it would be better if it was never placed there in the first place. But it is there, and it is what we know now. And frankly, it would be equally awkward to remove it from our shoe. The loss becomes a part of us. This understanding and idea of how to live with grief in general has changed over the years, as have our rituals. It was once thought that we were to get past grief, get over it, as I said. But lately there is an idea of grief integration. That is, as I just described it with our stone. Grief may soften over time, but it never really disappears. Some days the grief is more acute than others, perhaps on holidays or an anniversary, or because a sight or a smell or a taste triggers our memory. But we kind of learn to navigate it and to move through life with its grief as a part of us, its most paralyzing effects dissipating over time. That time, though, is much longer than most of us give it and that others tend to grant us. Historically, our grief was made visible to others, right? Widows wore black, some people donned an armband, or in the Bible and in Jewish tradition, they rent their clothing. These actions alerted the people around her that the griever was in an altered state. It was that outward sign of an inward reality so that we might adjust our expectations and our behaviors around the one who was grieving. Because people who are grieving may look perfectly healthy and fine, but they aren't. They're suffering. They are in emotional turmoil. They feel upended. They may experience brain fog, an acute feeling of disconnection with others. They may have a hard time focusing. They may be confused about time. They may be deeply sad and frankly not up to hearing your joyous news or the newest joke. They may look or act depressed. Some may even acknowledge that when the phone rings or they get up in the morning, they expect their loved one to just be there. They may struggle with bouts of anger and even outright confusion. They themselves may even wonder if they are having a mental breakdown or beginning to suffer from some kind of dementia. They may have what we refer to as grief bursts. That is what looks to an outsider like a breakdown, but to the person themselves is simply the releasing of all that they are carrying, but when the walls have fallen away. They may literally and figuratively push those closest to them away for fear that any sign of love or connection could cause them to melt into an abyss. They may also have none of the above. or have been dealing with anticipatory grief for so long that they actually feel a bit of relief and are ready to finally get on with things. Unfortunately, these days we don't have these outward markers to tell others about the state we are in, and there are more people carrying this than you realize every day. Even our workplace norms aren't necessarily helpful. Some are lucky to get a few days off from work to attend to the issues that result from someone's death, and others don't get these luxuries. And additionally, some people who are grieving don't want others to know about their grief. It is just too raw. They don't want to acknowledge that they are in such a fragile state for fear that it makes them look weak or vulnerable. And sometimes we're our own worst critic, saying that we should be the ones to get on with it, that we should be back to normal, whatever that is, sooner than we allow ourselves. Death changes us. It is in an experience that we will carry throughout our life. It is a weight that may vary over the course of our life, but its presence won't. Even if our relationship with the person was not what we had wanted it to be, grief can still be very deep. When we grieve a person's death, we not only grieve the loss of who they were, but also who we hoped they would be and who we might be together. We grieve for the role that they played in our life. Sometimes our grief at the loss of a person even catches us off guard years later. Jacob, my son, literally at the sink the other day said to me, "If Poppy, my father, were alive, do you think he would have changed his mind about moving up here so that he might be around the girls, Jacob's twins, and his great-granddaughters more?" My dad's been dead for 8 years, and yet this was the conversation at the sink. Because our hearts grieve in sorrows that are not limited to time or space or logic even. In the Hebrew Testament, there's a story of King David. King David was being challenged for his throne by his own son, Absalom. And so you would expect that King David, King David dispatched an army to quell the uprising. In the melee, though, despite his orders to protect his son Absalom was killed. And the scene that follows is heart-wrenching. When King David is told about Absalom's death, this great ruler becomes a mourning father that is unconsolable. He weeps, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I would die instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son." At first, he can't even be roused to greet the returning triumphant warriors who had protected his throne and his life. His grief for his son and the relationship that would not be consumed him and clouded his ability to do even the most regular royal duties. And we know that even Jesus wept at the death of his friend Lazarus. In our faith, we do dream of a day when we are reunited with our loved ones, but that doesn't mean that we are spared the loss, that grief that we feel today in the moment. Even those that I have worked with to plan funerals, who feel their loved ones as close as their breath and believe that they continue to communicate with them, still feel that ache of loss because their loved one is not physically present anymore. They grieve the loss of their loved one's touch and hug and general physical presence. Grief is as much a part of life as love, and it doesn't need to be feared, and it can be welcomed. It is a reminder of the love that built that reservoir that holds the grief. And this is a part of what All Saints' Day, or Dia del Muerto, is about. Because just because someone has died, it doesn't mean that that person and your love needs to be set aside. It doesn't mean that the relationship must end just because they are dead. Your relationship with the one who you love can continue through actions that you take every day, through the flowers that you place on their grave, or donations that you give in their name, in the conversations where you talk about them, or even to them, in eating their favorite food, or going somewhere where they would have wanted to go. Grief is not a malady. It is not something to be cured or something to rid yourself of. It is a reminder of the love that you had. It is a precious remnant of the relationship that you had with that person. And today, as we remember those who have gone from this earth, let us also remember those who held them close to their hearts. And remember to ask them to share their story about their loved ones so that we can carry them in our hearts too. Don't worry that you might upset them by naming the person who has died. They want to hear their name. Now, they may cry, but it is a relief and a blessing to a grieving person to know that others are thinking of their loved one too. Sometimes we feel very isolated in our grief, and by talking about it, that connections get rekindled. This week, for example, I actually got a note from my aunt with just a few different pictures of my parents, and the note basically said, "I was cleaning out, and I found these. I thought you might like them. I miss your mom and dad, Aunt Nancy." As I said, my dad has now been gone for 8 years, and my mother, who's Aunt Nancy's sister, for 22. Yes, and you can see it even now. The tears well up just thinking about it. Yes, it does bring up all sorts of mixed feelings, but it's also a warm wash of love on a broken heart. Our lives will inevitably have losses, some that even feel unbearable. Like King David, we may need someone to help us just put one foot in front of the other for a while. This is the cost of love and hope, and it is normal to feel lost and empty and sad, and sometimes even angry. And you don't have to process your grief any differently than you are, no matter what your kids say or your spouse says or a friend says. Because there are lots of models for grief, but you're not a model. You're you. You know what you need, and you have the right to grieve in a way that is right for you. So today, may we remember and take comfort in the promises of God, in the memories of our loved ones, and in each other. Amen.